him. And God's people through the centuries saw their loved ones torn from them. Early on, the Franciscans, a mystical society, and the Dominican monks were given authority to destroy human lives in terrible ways. Millions of people lost their lives. The record of it will never be known. Whole countries, genocides of whole people, whole areas, thousands were wiped out and repopulated by Roman Catholics. The Waldenses, of course, became the best known because they preserved their history so well, and they lasted so long as the Lord preserved that faith. Some of the scenes, of course, are too vile to even think about. But it was at the time of the Reformation when the church in the wilderness merging with the Reformers. And remember that each of the Reformer churches was started by a Catholic monk. God could reach right into that system and reach a man that was in the depth of heathenism and bring him out if his church wouldn't do the work. And so finally God's church in the wilderness, which had set aside much of its historic movement, joined the Reformation, Roman Catholics, now giving a message to warn people against that church. Nothing could stop the movement of the Reformation. The church was beside herself. The nobility of Europe was pulling away from the church. When that monk Luther nailed the theses to the door of his church, it was the mark of the end for Catholic supremacy throughout that period. Many others rose. John Knox, of course, here he's in Scotland, and others. By 1536 in Geneva, the Reformation was on a solid footing, sending out missionaries throughout the world. It was at this time then that the church needed some power that could fight against the force of God that was permeating everything. And so the great controversy tells us it was at this time the order of the Jesuits was created, the most cruel, unscrupulous, and powerful of all the champions of popery, cut off from earthly ties and human interests, dead to the claims of natural affection, reason, and conscience, holy silence. They knew no rule, no tie but that of their order, and no duty but to extend its power. There was no crime too great for them to commit, no deception too base for them to practice, no disguise too difficult for them to assume. Vowed to perpetual poverty and humility, it was their studied aim to secure wealth, power, to be developed to the overthrow of Protestantism and the reestablishment of papal supremacy, and their plans never changed, folk. Don't think that they're not still working today. When appearing as members of their order, they wore a garb of sanctity, but under the blameless exterior, the most criminal and deadly purposes were often concealed. It was a fundamental principle of the order that the end justifies the mean. By this code, lying, theft, perjury, assassination were not only pardonable, but were commendable when they served the interests of the church. From the time of Augustine, the church believed that it was her responsibility to fight evil in this earth, to persecute those who would not believe the truth, and to build up the kingdom of God on earth so that Jesus could come and take the throne of it. And that's the secret philosophy that has created such a monster out of these people. There in the valley of Loyola, far in the northern part of Spain, is this great and beautiful, beautiful monastery. The monastery is built around a magnificent chapel that's designated to the one who was born there, Inigo Lopez Ricaldo. Later, the name was Romanized to Ignatius de Loyola, or the fire, or the one who ignites from the valley of Loyola. But as we see this statue, we realize they've made a god out of this man. But that headquarters of that monastery is more than just a place to come and pray to Loyola. Because there within the monastery, as I walked through the halls, I was given a walk through it. I wanted to buy a postcard, and the store was on the other side. The priest brought me right through the monastery, and he stopped, and he brought me into this room. And he said he could speak very good English. And he explained that this room was where provincials and representatives from all over the world came to meet and to plan and to talk. And on each one of those seats, there was a little button that could be pressed, and then they would hear the speaker in their own language. Up above, behind the stage, there were windows where translators would sit, and the people could sit and listen to the speaker and hear it in their own language. They could talk, and it would be translated back in their own language. In this way, there's no language barrier. The whole world of the Jesuits can plan together whatever they want to do. Right there within the monastery is the castle where Ignatius was born to a wealthy, noble family. This has within the windows and in the artwork there the history of this young man who time and time again was brought to jail because of the crimes that he had committed. The jail records of the day say that he was just an impossible youth. He was rebellious and violent and evil. But he had a startling experience. In the experience of defending Spain and the borders of Pamplona, he encouraged a little band of Spaniards to withstand a whole French army. He had that much influence over their mind. And as he stood up on the walls to fight against the French for God and country, a cannonball hit the wall just below him, and he fell into the rubble. It shattered his leg. It broke it in two places, and his leg was permanently damaged. Poor Ignatius, a man who had so much pride. Back in those days, men wore leotards because the man's leg had to be beautiful to attract the women back then. And when that leg was damaged, this man who had so much pride had a nervous breakdown. He could not stand it. He called it later his vale of tears. But during the time that he was recuperated, and they had his leg on a rack, and he went through the most exquisite torture. They had to re-break his leg and set it again because it didn't heal right. And now with a leg that was shortened, a cripple, a mind racked because of nervous breakdown, he believed that he saw in vision Mary come to him, and he gave himself to her there. He believed that Jesus was a great general heading up an army, and that he wanted to conquer the world. And Ignatius dedicated himself to do that before this Satan coming as Christ to him. And so now, as a cripple in a coarse garment, he left the luxuries of his past, and he made his way across the countryside of Spain, there to find his way to the monastery of Montserrat, a magnificent castle of rocks, and there in the midst of it is an ancient center of Catholic worship. Believed that in the 6th century they found a statue here that was carved by St. Luke, and I don't know how St. Luke ended up carving a 6th century piece of artwork, but they taught the people that, and everybody believed it. And when you look up, now I headed up behind the stage, and I was looking for this statue. I'd read about it, and there it was. And I took my camera with me so I could take this picture for you. A little white stairway, all carved out of marble. It was beautiful. And I opened that little gate, and I walked in, and I looked at her. And there she was in front of me, right where Ignatius had stood. He had stood there, and he had stood there all night long staring at her as a knight in a vigil to dedicate himself. He confessed for 3 days in a row there at the chapel before the priests. And after I took the picture, I turned around, and I guess I was above the altar there in a little room because the whole congregation was out there in front of me, and they were having a program. So I quietly slipped off the other side. But Ignatius made his way to Manresa, and for 10 months he waited to get to Jerusalem. There he stayed in a cave. And there in that cave he sought out God, but he did it in the pagan format. He wore underwear that had barbs in it and sharp pieces of bone, and causing sores that got infected, and he was racked with infection. And he beat himself every day. The blood flowed from him. His body became white, emaciated, and weak. He would only allow himself to eat a little crust of bread, and he almost died in that cave. A man that had a nervous breakdown now had done this to himself. And there in that condition, he claimed that he began to see visions and dreams of Mary and Jesus and Satan before him. He said at that time in his life he became a different man with a different mind, and that he had learned the true secrets or the mystical teachings of Roman Catholic doctrines. And that's the occult esoteric of the mysteries. And I believe Satan brought this man to that at that time. He wrote, and he continued to write from that time, a little notebook where he analyzed his own mind and how he came into this position. And now that notebook, that little book that he carried around his neck, is called The Exercises of Loyola. And every Jesuit has to spend 1 month out of the year, 30 days, going through this practice in order to develop the ability to have his mind control his emotions. Within this, a man, just like on a songbook, has their master Jesuit has to guide them through what to say, how to feel, what to breathe, when to scream, when to roll on the floor in agony. And they take them all the way through the life of Christ, descending into hell and then ascending to heaven. And as they do this, their minds are completely taken over. And these scenes that are embedded deep in their subconscious minds are the motivating force that make them able to face death